Tariffs, retaliation, and supply chain impacts is our topic for panel 2. We've heard a lot today already about Section 232 and Section 301, the U.S. tariffs that were imposed on steel imports under Section 232, and U.S. tariffs imposed on Chinese goods under Section 301, and the retaliation that has resulted from that. So this panel is going to unpack those impacts a little bit more for us, and we've got a really great complementary set of perspectives here to help us do that. We have first Dr. Edward Balistreri from Iowa State University. He's an associate professor in the Department of Economics there, and is also involved with the Center for Agricultural and Rural Development there. His research focuses on the formulation of theory-based simulation models and the empirical calibration of advanced models of international trade. He has put those models to work to study Nebraska, and will present the results of that research on the estimated economic implications of retaliatory tariffs on Nebraska's economy. Next, we'll have Chris Roth, who is the president of Reinke Manufacturing Co, the world's largest privately held manufacturer of center pivot and lateral move irrigation systems. Chris is also a board member of the National Association of Manufacturers, past board member of the Irrigation Association, and a board member and past chair of the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and chairman of Invest Nebraska Incorporated. And he'll describe the impact of these tariffs on Reinke. And finally, we'll hear from David Morfesi, who is special counsel and director of international trade at Minter Ellison, which is Australia's largest law firm. He's also a commercial advisor at Saab, Australia. And he's also, right now, the Yeutter visiting professor of law in the Nebraska College of Law here and the Yeutter Institute. And is also currently teaching a combined law and graduate course in international agricultural trade right now here. David previously served as a trade negotiator for the U.S. government as well, including involvement in 16 free trade agreements that are in force today. And so David will talk about where these tariffs came from and how their impacts match up with the basis for imposing them. And I, as you know probably pretty well already by today, I'm Jill O'Donnell, the director of the Yeutter Institute, and I'll be moderating this panel. So we're going to go ahead and start with Dr. Balistreri to walk through the research results here about the impacts of retaliatory tariffs on Nebraska's economy.
Thanks, Jill.
Yep.
And thank you for having me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm the numbers guy in the crowd, right? So just to give you a little bit of background, I used to work at the U.S. International Trade Commission in the early 2000s. And did a lot of numeric simulation work. There's a slew of free trade agreements that under the George W. Bush administration. And I did a lot of the quantitative analysis for the U.S. government at that time. So, but I also did a lot of work on state level modeling. And there's some exciting things going on right now with a data consortium at the University of Wisconsin. And we're starting to, there's a lot of challenges involved in doing state level modeling, much more so than doing US level numeric modeling. So, and a lot of those deal with the data. I mean, we don't have tariffs in between states, and so there's no reason to collect data on trade between states, and so there's significant challenges there. So anyway, I'm going to just talk about the model that I coded up to look at the impacts of the trade war on Nebraska. And this is follow-up work. I actually did a study with co-authors last year on Iowa. And you know, we're trying to push the frontier on the modeling exercises and to get some decent quantitative analysis at the state level. Just moving forward, you know, the U.S. has a global cost advantage in agriculture, and that's, in some ways, that's about the extent of trade theory that we need to know, is that we have a cost advantage in ag products, and so those are going to be naturally our export goods. But for sure, we want to look at what are the impacts at the state level. And so to give you bottom line numbers, we're looking at about $395 million of welfare loss in Nebraska. And that averages, you know, that on average, that would be about $600 per household. And then we've got the revenue impacts by specific industries, oilseed farming, which would include the soybeans, obviously, about 74 million, grain farming, 87 million. And there is a positive electronic manufacturing has a slight revenue bump in Nebraska. And this was a little bit surprising look at Nebraska relative to Iowa. In Iowa, we have an aluminum smelter. And so, in fact, in Iowa, there were many more industries that actually fared better. But because Nebraska is so concentrated on agriculture, we see much more uniform negative impacts in Nebraska, and I'll talk a little bit more about those detailed results as we go along. Again, the methodology is going to be a general, what we call a general equilibrium simulation model. And this is a model which tries to capture all of the supply and demand relationships, all of the technologies, and the income balances that economists will call a general equilibrium. And so there's going to be a significant focus on this as a general equilibrium analysis, which is opposed to a partial equilibrium analysis. A partial equilibrium analysis would be where I say, I see that the price of soybeans has gone down by 5%, and then I want to calculate what's the revenue impacts on that one market. This is an analysis that has all of the markets interrelated, and there's a real good reason why we need to do that. In international trade, if you talk to economists, it's really hard to think about international trade without talking about general equilibrium. And that's because imports and exports through the balance of payments are inherently linked. That is, if I impose a tariff, that has a negative impact on my export industries regardless of retaliation. Now, retaliation, of course, makes the impacts larger, but regardless of retaliation, in the context of a general equilibrium, there's going to be negative impacts on the export industries. And this is not a new theory. So David Ricardo, in 1817, first establishes the basis of our current thinking about international trade. So there's within econ theory, we have these technical theorems, the gains from trade theorem. That is, there are gains from trade. And these are not gains from trade that are contingent on trading with another market economy, trading with an economy that doesn't subsidize their industries. There are gains from trade. Now, of course, there are distributional consequences of trade. And that's really what's important, is to think about what are the impacts on the different agents within the economy. So within countries, we would generally expect winners and losers. Steel workers are going to think about trade much differently than a grain farmer. Although the gains from trade theorem still holds in that the gains to the winners outweigh the losses to the losers. And then it really falls on the domestic governance to determine what is the distribution, what's the fair distribution of the gains. And then also across countries, countries are going to gain more or less. So I threw up a few popular myths about trade, and I think they fundamentally come from this notion of looking at trade from a partial equilibrium perspective. I'll just refer you to this recent paper I had in the Ag Policy Review, which is published by the Center for Ag and Rural Development at ISU. But these are popular things that you see floated around, and economists just sort of cringe when you hear these things, because they're fundamentally not true within the context of economic theory. I'm going to skip over some of that. So I part that slide with this question: are these just things that elites talk about? Economists I love to talk to economists. I love to give presentations to economists, and because we speak the same language, we have a common understanding, a common sort of knowledge base. And then the question is, are these things that economists just talk about one another, like the gains from trade, and they don't really have any tangible manifestation in terms of the impacts on everyday people? And so every once in a while, I think our polity has to figure out, maybe we should test that. Maybe we should, put those elites to the test. And I would say that, we have some examples in the past. The 1930s are a good example. But then there's of course other examples like the financial crisis where, I think there is a big burden that's placed on economists thinking about, what happened during those business cycle impacts and whether that was really, the fault of economics more generally. So I'm going to look at a few scenarios. I'm going to jump into the numbers. I don't want to talk too much about things without getting into the meat of it. The scenarios I'm looking at are current tariffs. So that includes the U.S.-China trade dispute. It also includes the steel and aluminum tariffs. It includes all of the retaliatory measures that our trade partners have imposed on us. Then I have a scenario which gives us larger impacts, which is December. This is the escalation in the tariffs. And then I go back to the steel and aluminum tariffs from March. And those, so we'll look at those numbers, and they're quite a bit smaller. So this slide just gives you the overall welfare impacts. And this is sort of an econ-specific sort of measure of impacts, and there's theoretic reasons why we like to use welfare as an impact rather than say the impact on GSP or gross state product, which I'll present those in a moment, but these would be the numbers that I would present to an audience of economists, is that it basically costs at current tariff rates, it costs the Nebraska economy about $394 million. And that's about 0.5% of welfare. I've got the other regions printed out there. So the model is based on it's 20 regions. I've got, it's 20 sectors with 7 regions plus Nebraska and trade with the rest of the world. So we look at the Midwest, and the Midwest, which includes Minnesota, and those impacts are a little bit smaller than Nebraska. The impacts on Nebraska are fairly concentrated. Let's move on to... These would be the gross state product impacts, and you can see in this slide that the impacts escalate pretty dramatically if we go to the threatened tariffs in December. So in that case, we're looking at about 1% of GDP for the nation, and I would say that that's a sizable impact. I mean, that's looking at, putting that in some historical context. If we look at the same sort of numeric simulation models that measured the impacts of NAFTA, they're in the same ballpark. Now we have to remember that in most of the simulations historically, we were looking at liberalizations, and we're coming off of a fairly small base. That is that the U.S. economy was fairly open when we went into NAFTA, and so we would expect fairly small impacts on the U.S. of an agreement like NAFTA because we were already at very low tariff rates. It was really Mexican tariffs against the U.S. that were fairly high that were brought down by NAFTA. So I don't want to take too much time here. Let me just skip forward to the decomposition by sector. Again, these models are always a work in progress. We have 20 sectors now. We'd like to disaggregate that. And you'll notice that I'm using something oilseed farming instead of soybeans. And we'd really like to drill down into soybeans, but I'm limited on the data capacity at the global level when I run the global model to look at specific sectors which are in that model to give me price impacts. So oilseed farming is an aggregate. Now in the U.S., or in particular in the Midwest, that's mostly going to be dominated by soybeans, but that may not be true across the world, and so we would much rather have a more disaggregate model. Services are really a problem. We don't talk about services much, But services definitely dominate modern economies. And in particular in Nebraska, yes, services include burger flippers, but it also includes accountants, tax preparers, University of Nebraska Extension employees. So services is this big lumped together sector, and we would like to get some disaggregation in there. And for sure, services in Nebraska is going to be a sector that contributes enormously to the export activities of Nebraska. And so a lot of the services are business service support for agriculture. And so all of those links are built into the model, and so there's negative impacts on the service sector that feed through the impacts on exports. So we see here that grain farming income is down about $70 million, and oilseed farming is down about $60 million. And that those are income impacts; those are not gross output impacts. These are revenue numbers or gross output, and so those are slightly larger because that includes the impact on the intermediates. So those are the overall revenue numbers. Again, we have one sector at current tariff rates that actually gains, which is the electronics sector. Now, and it's important to realize that there's a distinction between a partial equilibrium and general equilibrium model in that this includes the impacts of the depressed commodity prices on livestock production or poultry production. And so these negative impacts, for example, on poultry, are incorporating in that the decreased price for grain. And so these numbers are net numbers, that they include those cross impacts. I'm sorry that this is sort of a data dump. This is what happens when you just get the model running on Sunday and then you've got to present it on Thursday. So, it's basically you generate tables instead of figures, which is a little bit it's not very friendly to the audience, right? This just breaks down those revenue numbers in percents, and of course, as we would expect, we have these much larger percentage impacts in the trade exposed sectors. Trade here is, I should be careful about my labeling. Trade is trade services. So those would be specific wholesaling and warehousing services. And we also see that transport is impacted pretty significantly here too. So let me just conclude. Again, those are the aggregate numbers that we get out of this simulation. I guess, if I'm talking to economists like to focus on the numbers and the theory, but I guess there's these broader questions of what are the goals of the U.S. policy, and I think the discussion in this conference is really nice. It's precisely aimed at these specific larger questions. We know that if we set up an economic model, we may not know what the bottom line numbers are, but we know before we start that if we're imposing these distortions, that it's going to be costly. The real question is sort of from the perspective of this research question is, well, by how much? Is it really important? And then there are these broader policy questions, and I think if we move to developing these models in a dynamic context, we want to think about what's going to happen in the future and how persistent are these impacts. Even if we had an agreement that came out of the discussions in Washington today over the next week, is China really going to be as dependent as it was on our agricultural products? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. I mean, if you look at what's gone on over the last couple of years, and look at Chinese investments in the Amazon basin, there's going to be some long-run impacts that are not captured in this static model. And so, again, these are models that are work in progress, and as soon as you generate a set of results, then you have a new set of questions that you want to ask of the model, and that involves model development. And so, anyway, that will conclude the numbers section for a moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed. Chris?
Sure. Thanks for having me very much. Just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know what we manufacture. We manufacture the large irrigation systems that are used for agriculture. So for those of you that don't travel into the rural areas, when you're flying in the planes and you look down and you see those big green circles on the ground, that's what we make. We make the big green circles. And so you can envision what we're doing when we're manufacturing that is we buy a lot of steel. That's the first thing that a lot of people think about. But we also have to buy tires to make them go around. We buy a lot of electrical components because those things are controlled by GPS, and we've got a lot of computer boards and things like that in there. We have to get the electricity from one end to the other, so we buy a lot of electrical cable across there. So we buy a very diverse product line. So everything from steel to rubber to electrical components to copper, zinc for the galvanizing process. So there's a lot to that process. And so we have a very varied supply chain that we have to deal with and pay attention to. So when Section 232 hit then in March of 2018, we were somewhat prepared for that because you hear that it's coming, but you don't know exactly when it's going to come, and you don't know exactly what the percentages are going to be and all that. So you try to figure that out. So you're somewhat prepared. But basically what happens to you then is when the 232 tariffs hit then, we don't buy any steel. I'll just focus on steel for now. We don't buy any steel from overseas. Everything we buy is domestic. We get the steel out of like Nucor out of Norfolk. We get some out of Missouri over to East St. Louis over that way. So we get all of our steel domestically. But when the 232 tariffs hit, then the domestic suppliers, they increased the cost of that steel dramatically and fairly quickly. And so we did have obviously some contracts in place, but then as time goes on, those contracts expire, and then you get new contracts, and then the cost of that steel has went up during that time period. So you're dealing with that. So going back to trying to explain about what an irrigation system is, so you've got different kinds of steel in the irrigation system, and you're not buying that steel all at the same time. So you're buying the steel for the water pipe maybe at a different time than you're buying the steel for the understructure. And so what ends up happening is we were fairly stable on our cost structure on what we were doing. But then over a period of time after the 232 tariffs hit, some of your costs are going to be higher, maybe dramatically higher, than maybe some of your other costs because it's at a lower price when you bought it. It just happened to be a timing issue. So then you get complicated. It gets complicated, and you're trying to figure out because it's all these different parts, and they all have different cost structures inside them. So it gets very complicated at that point. So time goes along, and then you get into the late spring of this year, and then the tariffs came off, the 232 tariffs came off of Canada and Mexico. So when that happened then, the steel for Canada then was able to come back into the American market, and that helped drive costs down again in steel. Now the reverse happens to you though. Now you've got high cost stuff, and we didn't know when that was coming. There was really no notice that that was coming. You heard a little bit of rumors out there, but again, you don't know when that's exactly going to happen. So then the reverse happened to us is then you have some high cost steel, and then when you run out of that, then you got some low cost. So then you've got the same thing but the reverse. So you've got within your product structure, you've got some high cost, low cost, and you're trying to work your way through that, so then you can get back to more normalized. So since that happened in the late spring, you're starting to get through that. But your lead times on steel can be months. I mean, it's not like you go out and buy it and you get it delivered next week. You have to forecast, and you have to try to work on that well in advance. So there's some issues related to that that you have to try to work through and do your best forecasting when you do that. The other thing that you can get yourself into, and Ambassador talked a little bit about this in the previous panel, is so you might have multiple sources. So like when we buy, say, electrical components, we will buy that from an American company, but they may be sourcing some of those components from overseas. They may be getting that from someplace else. We call that a third-tier supplier. We monitor that. We want to make sure that we understand who that third-tier supplier is because that can affect the quality of the product that we're putting out. So we watch that, but what we're really after is the quality. And so what ends up happening then is, say that cost just went up a lot on that, but then they may have an alternative supplier in a different country that maybe was not affected by the 232 tariffs. Maybe it was one of our allies, but then that supplier that was going to be able to do that, they can't handle a 100% switch over to that facility to supply all that. And so then you've got all that going on, and then so you get those disruptions going on about when you can get it in to your supplier, what's that cost structure going to look like? Obviously, everybody's fighting to try to get to the lower cost, so you're putting a lot of pressure on your suppliers to try to get to that point. So it does create, the 232 tariffs created some disruption, not just from a cost standpoint, but also just a supply standpoint of trying to get your hands on it so you can get into your facility so you can keep things going. Two other things that happened with 232, obviously, is when the 232 tariffs hit, which raised the prices on steel to the American manufacturers. At least for the ag manufacturers, at the same time what happened is obviously you had the retaliatory tariffs that came in, and the price of soybeans went down at the same time that our costs were going up for our American farmers. So that happened at the same time. So you have to work through that and try to understand then what is your sales going to look like, because all of a sudden now you had a fairly dramatic decrease in soybean prices, and how's that going to affect your customer? So you're trying to figure that out as well at the same time. And then when we export, so again, we export a fair amount of our product, and so obviously we have to pay close attention to currency. So during the same time when steel costs were going up, commodity prices were going down, the dollar got stronger, which then affects us negatively from an export standpoint. Because when you're trying to export, if the dollar gets stronger, then it hurts you when you're trying to export. And then we have manufacturers that we compete against from all over the world. So for instance, the euro against the dollar has gotten weaker, which makes them more competitive. So our costs are going up, and then the dollar got stronger, which makes it a little harder to do the exporting. So that's kind of a high-level summary of how the 232s have affected, I would say probably not just us, but most agricultural manufacturing companies in the States.
David?
Well, I'd have to say that between one point that Ed made about services and that description of the concentric circles of effect across one particular business, it really brings to mind some of the things that aren't being said about a lot of this. And one of them is those concentric circles of impact. Services, thank God somebody said it, because services make up approximately 80% of the GDP of the United States. Now, if targeted tariffs on goods are going to have impacts in that area, we need to be thinking about that, and we need to understand that that's the case, because that is a very, very big deal. It's a very big deal when you need steel, but it's a very big deal across the board to everyone when it impacts that big of a sector of the economy. So I'm glad to have heard that, and it's a very interesting thing about all these questions is that we can chase however many different tangents, and they're all correct. Everything people have brought up, they're sort of layered on top of one another here all day today. From my point of view, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the basis for these tariffs. I'm a lawyer, and I was also a trade negotiator. And when I'd be sitting across the table from someone and they were telling me why they were going to put a barrier to trade in front of us, I would try to pick apart the basis for it. Section 232, we've been hearing it all day, and the basis is that those imports threaten or impair the national security. And we've heard that there's an exception to that in the GATT. Section 301, more broadly, is unreasonable or discriminatory acts by a foreign country where burdens or restricts the United States commerce. do these tariffs actually go towards these ends? Do they achieve these goals? Do they address these issues? Because if I were sitting across the table, that's the question I'd be asking. One of the things that came to mind specifically, we'll go to unreasonable and discriminatory acts that burden or restrict U.S. commerce. Well, everybody's talked about disruption, they've talked about instability, and they've talked about cost. So that's what a trade war gives you in terms of, people have said today, you don't win these things. So if you're using that to try to address an instability, well, what's the instability and what's the cost? So that really needs to be thought about in terms of, is that really a justifiable reason for doing this? And there's plenty of reasons, and we've talked about what China has done and how they act as a trading partner. Lots of things need to be fixed. Is this the way to fix it? And is this the best and most least trade restrictive, I should say, way to fix it? That'll let us all keep going as partners when we're done. Because very different than litigation, trade disputes at the end are supposed to leave you in a place where you're partners again and you're marching boldly on. It's not I win and you lose. It's we're together and we're up here now as opposed to down here. That's where you want to get. But there's one great thing, and I used to have fun with the European Union, actually it was. I used to hammer them on this. And it was what we call, in this case, we call them exclusions. The Europeans used to like to call them derogations. And I loved it when they brought up derogations. I had the privilege of negotiating trade in wine. And let me tell you, producers couldn't pour enough of it for us, so it was great. But the Europeans would say, you can't bring it in unless you make it in a winemaking practice that we recognize and that we know as a winemaking practice. If you have one that's different than ours, you can't do that because we can't guarantee it's safe. Well, maybe you can bring it in, but you can't call it wine. Oh, well, that's pretty strict. I noticed that Argentina seems to be bringing a lot of it in. Yeah, they've got a derogation. So wait a second, this is unsafe for public health if it comes from the United States, but if it comes from Argentina, it's just fine. Well, I come from Australia. You know what they're bringing in here, tariff-free? Steel and aluminum. You know, up north from where I am is a nice little place called South Korea. They make a hell of a lot of steel. Guess where it's going? Without tariffs. Is this a national security issue? Can you justify that? It's the first question I'd ask. It's what I'd want to know if I was the negotiator on the other side of the table. So are we achieving goals that make this an excusable and justifiable barrier to trade? I don't know about that. We've talked about tariffs and talked about the costs of them. There's a difference between a cost and a price. And quite often the question has been lately, who pays for them? Who pays the tariff? And yeah, I said I'm a lawyer. How do you do this? The importer pays the customs agency the tariff, and then I guarantee you they pass it on to the consumer who pays it. So when the tariff is levied here, it is the consumer that pays that tariff. But there's another question that's not being asked, but it is being asked, because there's a fellow back here who asked it to me this week, and I thought it was one of the best questions I've heard in ages. I've been led to believe, he said, that the subsidy that offsets the losses in soybeans is paid for by the tariffs we're levying. How can that be? And it was a very politically asked question because it was somewhat incredulous. How could that be? Well, we had just seen a very good presentation, and one of the slides showed a graph of soybean exports to China. When China levied tariffs on soybeans, 0. It dropped to 0. Let me ask you all a question. Some of my students are here. You don't have to answer, even though you're used to it. How much tariff are you collecting on 0? Not a lot. So how exactly is that going to offset these subsidies? Where are they coming from? I'm not 100% on that, but I'll tell you it's not from the tariff that made that a necessity. I'll tell you another impact. We talked about how today several speakers talked about enlisting the help of our friends and how we're treating our allies. Yeah, Australians, they have a rather thick skin. They're good friends to have. They'll stick around. No matter how nasty you treat them sometimes, they kind of get that and they're tough. You know, things happen. You got to do things now and again. But it's not necessarily, that impact isn't, it's not small. Have you heard that about the red sand we have in Australia? You know why it's red? It's iron ore. It's on the surface. We don't have to dig 1,000 feet down to find it. It's everywhere. Unless the ground is green, and then you've found copper. I'm not kidding. I swear to God, 45 minutes from my house, there's a hill that's green. And it's not because of grass, because we have no rain. It's copper. But it's not just the iron ore. It's not just the minerals. 42% of all of the apparel sold in the United States comes from China. We happen to have a lot of sheep. And we also have a lot of sun, so those sheep are hot. So we do them a favor and we shear them now and again. Raw wool exports to China have gone almost to 0 because they have such a surplus there now, because they no longer have to send apparel to the United States. Now, does Australia hold a grudge against the United States? Quite often, as I was one of the negotiators for the US FTA, and Australians would come up to me and say, we have a $20 billion deficit with your country since that FTA, and it's your fault. And I like to point out that a great deal of that $20 billion is made up of heavy high-tech equipment sold by the United States to Australia. A really big proportion of that $20 billion. And at the same time, during the same period, Australia has a $60 billion trade surplus with China on raw materials, mainly iron ore and things of that nature, that they dug up with high-tech, heavy equipment. So it's cheeky of me to speak on behalf of Australia, but thank you very much for our trade deficit. We appreciate it. I want to mention a couple of things on a totally different note. There are more tariffs in the news this week, and I do this, I occasionally will say things like to my students, and I draw the answers out of them. Boeing versus Airbus came out this week. Just so you can get an idea when we're talking about tariffs, the news isn't always quite the news. It's not fake news, it's not incorrect. It's more context that you need to understand. So $7.5 billion in tariffs that the US can levy. Did you see these headlines? Just some acknowledgement here. Yeah, people are nodding their heads. You can help me, you have a microphone. Did you read in the news what they're going to levy tariffs on?
I did not.
You didn't, did you?
Yes.
What are they?
Ag products.
Well, ag products, what are they?
I didn't look specifically, but
Olive oil, Italian cheese, and what else? There was one other one. Scotch whiskey, wine. Italian wine,
French wine.
French wine, Italian cheese, Spanish olives, Scotch whiskey. Wow. is that where the tariffs are really going to come from? Like, what are the main tariffs? Think of the case. We're going to put tariffs on airplanes. It's the Boeing and Airbus case. Delta Airlines has a great number of planes that they're waiting to take shipment for from Airbus. They're going to get tariffs, and that's going to be a lion's share. Then why do we talk about French wine? Why do we talk about Italian cheese? Because it's emotional. They're hitting you on the farm, and we're hitting them on the farm. These are the people that we care about. These are political issues. That's why the headline is not about how much we're going to charge them for airplanes. It's how much we're going to charge them for wine and cheese. Do I have a minute? Mm-hmm. Quick, just a couple of quick ones because I get to sit here, so until they turn off my microphone, I'll keep talking. Uche this morning talked about supply chains. He talked about global value chains, really, is what he was talking about, and how that affects some of this. And then he talked about the trade deficit. And he talked about the iPhone in China. And I just want to throw out some statistics that I have on the iPhone 5, tell you how old they are. The iPhone 5 was worth $699. So when you added up how many iPhone 5s were ordered when it first came out and shipped out of China, that contributed $2.4 billion to the trade surplus with China, that China had with the United States. $2.4 billion. $699 times the number of iPhones was that number. Of course, the only value added by the Chinese was the assembly, which was $7 per iPhone. But the trade deficit was $699 a piece. Just so you get an idea, you need to have context and you need to understand what you're reading when you see it. So that's, those are the kind of things you have to keep in mind. There was a great question from the fellow from the Farm Bureau today. Hey, we joined the WTO, and we said we were going to do all these things. Now we're doing something else. I think there's one positive out of all of these actions that I've seen, is that it puts the question of sovereignty to rest. We never lost it. We could have always done these things. So why didn't we? Why didn't we get up and tip over the apple cart? Because it was overwhelmingly in our interest not to do that. We had other things to accomplish. Sovereignty was never a question. That's not how it works. John was talking about the WTO and saying it's not binding, it's a unanimous decision of this body, and then you go off and do what you will with it. It's like having an English policeman with a stick, and you're over there. Stop! Or I might yell stop again, because I can't do anything about it. That's what binding is. And so, and I will end quickly, because one of the students had a great question as well, is how do we sell it? And this has bothered me for 20 years of trade policy. How do you sell it to the public? And I'm getting used to the fact that it's not a today question. You want to sell something, it's somebody going to come and buy, and I want that, and I need that today. The benefits of trade are a long game. And you need to plan, and you need to know that for the future, this is how it's going to work. And I'll use the analogy. Anybody been on a cruise? Yeah, fun, eh? Nice. So you're on the big cruise ship. If you go into the wheelhouse and grab the wheel and give it a big spin on a cruise ship, the only thing you're going to accomplish is the all-you-can-eat buffet is going to be upset. And you're going to see what happens when 2,000 people get sick simultaneously. But if you go into the wheelhouse and you turn the wheels so that you are going 1 degree differently than you were before, the shuffleboard tournament goes on the top deck, but at the end of the day, you're in a very different place from where you started. That's trade, and that's the benefit thereof. It's the 10 years from now. I live in Australia. There are still houses in my neighborhood where the bathroom facilities are outside. You know what common everyday Australians will base their prosperity on is the fact that in the 70s and 80s, they dropped their protective tariffs and life changed. And these are people very much in living memory. Their life changed for it. So don't grab the wheel and give it a spin. Just remember what we're doing here. So how do you sell it? I'm getting used to not selling it. I'm getting used to planning for it. I think that was one of the best things I heard today. And it's really Clayton Yeutter type thinking of, and I get this from Australia. Clayton was very well regarded by his counterpart in Australia, who is a friend of mine, who told me that the Australia-US FTA was basically Clayton's idea. And he said, we're natural partners. We just have to wait for the time when it's feasible to be able to collect that benefit. So be patient and we'll get there. 15 years later, I got to be one of those negotiators that delivered it. Let's be patient, we'll get there. Thanks.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, Jill, and thank you to the Institute and the university. This is like the cherry on the sundae of a great couple of weeks here with some great students, and I really am humbled by the ability to be here.
Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists. We have a little time for questions.
Along with your comments, we're all concerned about how international trade is affecting the agricultural community, but how is it also affecting the number of hungry people without adequate housing here in Lincoln, Nebraska? I grew up in a Midwest industrial town where the banks of the Mississippi were lined with very large industrial factories. They were union factories, they paid excellent wages, and a large portion of my high school fellow graduates went to work there, earned excellent wages, bought new cars, lived in nice middle-class neighborhoods. That area now is all either abandoned factories or torn down that's growing up in weeds. So because first those companies moved to southern states where they didn't have unions or it wasn't required, and then eventually they moved to Mexico or China. So, I mean, it's easy to curse China for our problems in agriculture, but what are we doing in terms of the general population as it impacts through international trade?
I guess I'll just make one comment on that. I mean, I guess, there are a slew of domestic problems, and the one key thing that economists and trade economists maintain is that to the extent that you have a problem in your domestic economy, trade policy is about the most costly way of solving those problems. So if you don't want your steel, or you want to maintain a certain level of output of your steel industry, using trade policy is the wrong way of solving that problem. A direct subsidy is always superior to trade policy because trade policy involves two distortions. It involves a distortion on the producers and consumers. Whereas if you just have a subsidy, that's only one distortion in the producer market. To the extent that there are problems, domestic problems that we face, and we don't like the mix of industries within the country, or we don't like what's happening with labor, there are direct mechanisms that are always going to be cheaper than trade policy.
But before we go, yeah, please go ahead. But before we go ahead, give you the analogy from Australia as well, because we're having much the same impact in Australia. One of the big issues that Australia faces is that labor is incredibly expensive, comparatively speaking. while labor standards are high, labor prices are enormous. On the one hand, it's great to sit in a restaurant and not have the waiter want you to leave so that they can get the next table in, because they don't have to worry about tips, they're getting paid. But at the same time, it leads to prices that are unsustainable and costs that are unsustainable. And I agree that it's not necessarily trade that's going to solve all of that. It can take advantage of efficiencies where they exist, but inefficiencies are going to be exaggerated. And that's the problem, and the inefficiencies that get exploited in a trade relationship. Then I turn to the economist for that one, because that's a lot. That's not law.
Yeah, thanks very much. I had a question for Mr. Roth. You did a very good job of kind of laying out some of the challenges that the current policy environment is creating for your company. Can you tell us at all about how you've responded? Are you changing your sourcing patterns at all? Have you changed your currency hedging strategies? Or are you just kind of hoping all this will get better and that the downsides and the upsides are kind of balancing off, so you're going to be okay keeping the ship steady?
Right. That's, again, Ambassador kind of talked about that. If you're going to make some supply chain changes, that's not something you do by Tuesday. So it takes a long time. So that's one of the things you have to try to read the tea leaves, like we heard earlier, as best as you can, to try to understand if you should be changing your supply chain or if you should just keep steady and believe that it's going to work itself out eventually. Because it does cost, it's not easy to switch, it does cost money to switch. And so you have to balance that out in your own mind as far as, is it worth the cost to switch a supply chain channel to something else, or is it better to stay where you're at? And so we've kind of tended to kind of stay with our suppliers that we have, because we enjoy the quality that we get from those suppliers. And anytime you introduce a new supplier into your supply chain, you always have concerns about that you have to make sure you test and be aware of. So we have a tendency to stick with who we got because we trust them.
We often see that commodity markets take a large hit in these trade conflicts, agricultural commodities specifically. Do you think that a move towards marketing more differentiated agricultural products on the global stage instead of so much of the commodity markets would be a smart move to make for countries like the United States, as commodities are so often hit and are vulnerable in that way?
I guess I could speak to that question a bit. Part of when we think about trade as economists, there tends to be a tension between specialization and diversification. And in traditional trade theory, we don't think about risk very much, and so there's the dominant. You get some gains through specializing in what you're good at, but certainly there's an older literature that talks about risk in the terms of trade, and in that case, there's an inherent balance that you're going to want to diversify. And just in the current context, if we look at what China is doing exactly that. They're looking at their position 3 years ago, and they're realizing right now that they were heavily dependent on ag products from the United States, and I think their portfolio is going to be changing. It is currently in transition away from that single supply stream.
I'd add the fact that I'm glad you didn't use the phrase that's quite often used in asking a question like that, all things being equal.
Serves its purpose.
Yeah, well, the thing is, yes, it does serve its purpose, theoretically, because all things are never equal. Why are we growing so much of the commodity products, well, we support the growth of commodity products. That's not a bad thing, but it's what we do. So that has to be part of your calculus as well. What's the benefit as opposed to the risk? It's not just a level playing field. The government comes out and says, now you're going to be healthy. We're going to put little, since I've been in Australia, you now have calorie labels on everything. So, you get the worst possible thing out of a vending machine, and it tells you right on the front of it how bad it is for you. Here's all the calories and everything that's in it. Wow, okay. I never knew that's what I've been eating all my life. But what they do tell you is to eat 5 and 2. But they don't necessarily support 5 and 2. They support the commodities. That's the ones that, so the question is not just should we diversify, but what are all the inputs and factors that make this worth doing and that not worth doing? And how does that enter into a trade context and a trade equation? So your domestic question is as important to answer as your foreign trade benefit that you'd get from it.
We have time for one more. Okay.
Yeah, so just a point of clarification from Edward on the $395 million for Nebraska. Is that yearly, and does that include the MFP payments? Because we're being told that is making us whole. My farm numbers don't necessarily indicate that.
So that's a great question. There's a lot of details in the study that and assumptions that I've left out. That is an annual number, and what I've done is in this structural model, there's going to be some tariff revenues that come in, and then those are distributed. And so there is a transfer payment to Nebraska, and it's proportional to income. And so that's not the farm support payments. And so these numbers should be looked at as everything else equal, right? So you could have had another 300 ceteris paribus, sorry. So all other government policies equal. So, if the U.S. government, there is enough tariff revenue, and you're right, once the trade goes to zero, there is no tariff revenue for sure, right? But there is enough tariff revenue being collected right now such that if the U.S. government wanted to, they could easily make Nebraska whole. But, and so my study is done independent of those extra transfers that would be coming to Nebraska. Go ahead.
Well, the question that then raises is how sustainable is that system as opposed to being whole to start with?
Yeah, no, I mean, this gets into a huge debate, right? And that's why I make the simplest assumption that basically I'm holding all other transfers to Nebraska fixed. And it's because if you say, oh, well, there's this tariff revenue that we could actually make some of the Midwest states whole, then you have to take one step back and say, now wait a minute, we've just ramped up the government deficit enormously with the tax cut. And so, in fact, there's not that money. That money doesn't actually exist. Right? There's less money than the tariff revenues that are coming in because the government deficit swamps it. And so rather than sort of get into that debate, and without a dynamic model, it's going to be very hard to ask these questions about what does the government deficit mean. And so I've made the simplest assumption possible, which is consistent with the way that the US ITC does their trade studies, and just assume that all of that stuff is held fixed, and we don't worry about those things. So, again, these are works in progress, and to the extent that you're really interested in things like government deficits, transfer payments from the USDA, if you're interested in those things, then you have to build those features into the model, and they have to be accounted for in the original data. So, great question, though.
We're out of time for this panel, but thank you all for your comments and discussion today.